even if we were to try and increase fertility rates, that's going to take decades, to get people to grow up and to be workers. And it's much easier to just bring in people that are already of working age to fill in the gap, to increase the productivity, keep the economy going, to keep the pension system running operationally. It's just a fact that we don't have the birth rates to sustain it. And it's a tough issue, and there's no easy solutions. And I haven't seen any country that's been able to turn it around. It's a natural byproduct of industrializing. In children, all of a sudden, you go from a farming society, a low, lower income, where children are an asset, to suddenly they're a liability to have. They're not working for you. They're not tilling the fields and doing all these things that help out, which you'd see in poorer countries. And there's just no easy answer for that. But that's, I think, a big part of the immigration push. And until that situation gets solved in some way, or they turn it around, you're going to see a lot more of that. At least the governments are going to want to continue with the immigration push.
Matthew Horwood, thanks for joining me today, man. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Should be a good time.
Yeah, so you and I connected. I wrote a post on X about the food bank issue, and so I'll preface our conversation by kind of telling my story, because of course there were a lot of people on X who were like, you didn't really do that. This didn't really happen. And it actually did. So I was working on an essay about food insecurity. And I drive past the food bank in Southeast Calgary almost every single day. And every single day I drive by, it looks like a concert. Like, it is just packed with people. And it was kind of like you know how it is when you're writing something, you kind of have like a nucleus or a source, a seed for your story. And that was the seed for my essay. And I would drive by it every day. And every time I drive by it, a few more sentences would form in my head of what I was going to write down. But then I thought, well, rather than just driving by, why don't I park and actually go talk to a few people? I'm not a journalist in any way, shape, or form, but this is my journalistic effort to see like who's really going to the food bank and what's actually happening there. So I did that. And the thing that I had noticed in the many times that I drove by was that there were a lot of luxury vehicles in the parking lot. I would see Acuras and Audis and mostly Acuras and Audis, but a variety of like high-end vehicles. So I'm wondering, are these people who work at the food bank? If they do, they're making great salaries to be able to drive, Audi SUVs. And like, what exactly is happening inside, and who is coming in? Because a lot of the people that I'm seeing standing around outside aren't people that you would typically see at a food bank. Anyway, so I parked, went in. The first person I saw was a young Indian woman who works at the food bank. And I just struck up a conversation with her. And basically what she relayed to me was that, now again, this is conjecture, right? This is just based off of her experience and her assumptions about the people that she's seeing coming in. So, I mean, I don't know how accurate it is, but what she said was that a lot of the people coming in were new immigrants and people who appeared to be doing fairly well financially, appeared to have full-time jobs, were driving, luxury SUVs or mid-range SUVs like Hyundais and things like that. But people who didn't seem to really require a need for the food bank. And so before we move forward, for our American listeners, here in Canada, we refer to the food bank what you in the United States would refer to as a pantry or your town pantry, where people who are struggling or having a hard time financially would go and receive food donated to people in need. And what we've seen here in Canada is just this explosion of people relying on these donations in order to feed themselves and their families. So I wrote that little post. Of course, everybody started sharing it, liking it and stuff. And you reached out to me and sent me an article that you had written about the Ontario Food Bank. So Matthew, can you go into what you've seen and just through your own investigations, what you've uncovered about this issue currently happening in Canada?
Yeah, certainly. Well, that was the reason I reached out, was because a lot of the reporting I'd done, it checks out. It's kind of what I've been seeing and what food banks have told me. Back in 2023, I reached out to a number of different food banks because I had been hearing about a rise of international students seeking out food banks and some gaming the system, perhaps. And I had two food banks, one in Oshawa, one in Brampton, tell me that they had been seeing international students using the food banks in a manner that was maybe not adequate or not what you would normally see from people. I mean, they were misspelling their names. They were using swapping out their first and last names in order to get ahead of other people in line, to keep coming back to the food banks. Once they were getting their baskets of food, they were kind of leaving some on the ground, like they were only taking the foods that they wanted. And this was also in the context of videos on YouTube that had gone viral, semi-viral, of new international students talking about how to get free food in Canada and talking about how you can just go to a food bank and they'll just give you, food for free. You don't have to pay for it. You just have to wait in line a little bit, and using the food banks essentially in a way that's not proper, or not what a lot of people would, think is morally correct. But this is also in the context of, as you said, rising food costs. I mean, they went astronomical in the last couple of years. And, I reached out to some food banks and some like groups that represent food banks, and they relayed to me that it's just been horrible for food banks. I mean, they've had to start rationing the food that they give out. Like, the hampers have less food in them than they used to. 1 in 10 people in Toronto actually have used food banks. A large majority of the people using food banks are employed. They have one or two jobs, so they're not people who are down on their luck and are approaching homelessness or unemployed. They're actually normal Canadians who have been struggling to get by. So, of course, part of it could be the international students not using the food banks properly, but some of it is also just the cost of living in Canada in general. And for a lot of these international students, when they came to Canada, they were expected by the immigration department to have enough money to spend around $800 per month to get by. Well, there was a survey of, I think, 150 or so international students in Toronto, and they said they were spending around 1,500, so almost twice that per month in Canada. So the amount of money that they had to have to come to Canada had not been updated in years. I mean, it hadn't kept up with the cost of living. So all these students were getting here, and they were realizing that they can't make a living. They can't get by, and so I think some of them are turning to food banks for that reason, and some of them could perhaps be gaming the system and they don't understand the way things work in Canada, or they're trying to get by in a certain way. But it's certainly a lot of different crises coming together at once to make this issue.
So, Matthew, do you have any idea how many international students we've allowed into the country over, say, the last 5 years?
I don't have the exact stats on that, but I know it's around 4 million people or so from 2020 in terms of international students, temporary workers, actual immigrants. It's a lot of people. And the issue, too, is a lot of these international students and temporary foreign workers, they're expected to go back home pretty soon. And there's hundreds of thousands of them that are expected to just pick up and go, but they might not do that. And the government doesn't have the resources or the capacity to send them all back. And the Conservatives have raised that issue for a while now. So we're going to have to see just how many of these people end up going back.
Yeah. And, so this essay that I was writing, this food insecurity essay, really quickly turned into an immigration essay. And it's something that I've been struggling with for a number of years, because it's hard to have this discussion or to touch on the topic without it turning into a conversation about race. Because I think race is the lowest common denominator in that discussion. It's the easiest thing to see, and therefore people automatically assume that when you're talking about immigration, that you're commenting on racial differences and disparities. But what I've seen, or at least through my own thinking and really working it out in my mind, it's not a racial issue; it's a cultural issue. Mm-hmm. And that's and we're kind of conflating the two. And for example, like, I'm writing in this essay and I'm really kind of dissecting my own perspective on this, is, like, when you talk about, say, for example, a lot of the immigrants in Canada, international students, are from India. And we all have people in our lives who we love, who we're friends with, who are Indian. I don't know anybody who doesn't have any Indian friends. And so I was really trying to, like, okay, what differentiates, like, the, like, Indian people who have lived in Canada for a long time, who are part of Canadian society versus the people who are coming over now. And the differentiating factor is really culture, right? Is that people who immigrate to this country, especially immigrated prior to 10 or so years ago, the expectation is that you would assimilate into Western society, into Canadian or American society, and uphold the same Western value structure that we all kind of adhere to and references, like the central action. But the problem is that when you introduce these cultures at the pace that they've been introduced, they're really, especially with the prior DEI brainwashing that we all experienced during our own cultural revolution, there is no expectation for these new cultures arriving to assimilate into the pre-existing society. Now we're almost through the DEI, dogma indoctrination. We're expected to almost bend and break our own values, our own value system, in order to accommodate the cultures arriving here. And I think that's what's causing the clash. Do you see something similar happening?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. I mean, when you have so many immigrants coming again from India in a short period of time, it's going to be difficult for them to integrate, especially when you have a cost of, like a crisis with the cost of living. When you have so much housing that is not available for people, then you're going to have some differences, and you're going to have people like Canadians who have been here for a while start to get a little bit upset. They're going to look for a scapegoat. They're going to be upset about the rising cost of everything, and it's maybe in some cases easier to blame it on new immigrants as opposed to more extravagant, like worldly things, like the supply chain crisis, the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine, climate change that is in some cases like caused crop harvests to fail, which might have impacted food prices. That's a little bit more difficult to blame and to find a scapegoat as opposed to new immigrants, especially when these stories come out where they're using food banks in a manner that is morally wrong or kind of frustrating. But I definitely think there are different cultural differences that get thrown into the loop here, and especially within India, there's of course different regions and different groups that have different morals. And I've seen some of the Indians that have lived in Canada for a while kind of criticize that and almost say that the new immigrants coming here are from maybe a lower class or a lower standard than what maybe was coming here, decades and decades ago. And I know an Indian that I do jiu-jitsu with who has said he doesn't want to go back to India and he doesn't like Indians, and a lot of the people there maybe he wouldn't want coming over here, which is interesting to see, because like, shouldn't you support them? Shouldn't you want them all? But yeah, I mean, there's definitely the cultural shifts are something that maybe need to be reckoned with, but it's such a touchy subject that you're not going to see any politicians talk about it and really get in the middle of it. And the Conservatives as well, like they barely talked about that during the election, and it's just such a touchy subject. They didn't want to throw the lead they have or ruin it even further by discussing something like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding too, right? Like, like for example, a lot of the people at the food banks that I've seen, and I did take the time to speak to a few of them while I was there, are from Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And you see, there is a lot of Ukraine refugees in my community where I live outside of Calgary. And I've talked to a lot of the people in my community about their experience. And it's all the same story, that they were brought to Canada on a refugee program. We're told that they would find, that the Canadian government would help them find jobs in their field and get them settled here. But what happened in a lot of cases is that these people were dropped here with no follow-up, which has kind of left them. I mean, many of them don't have strong English skills. A lot of them don't have any experience in a Western country. They have no idea how to even get a job. And so they're relying on the food bank because they have literally been dropped here with nothing. And no communication, no help whatsoever. And then others were, say, for example, I have a young lady in my community who was a hotel manager in Kiev. When she arrived here, she was placed in a job as a hotel maid. And now, look, you can make the argument. You escaped the war. You're here now. You're safe. Take the job as the maid and work your way up. At least you're alive and you don't have bombs falling over your head and electricity going out and you have water to drink, right? But the way she explained it was that, you know, what she was told by the Canadian government was very misleading. And that had she have known she was coming to Canada to live in a, you know, basement suite and be a maid, she would have just taken her chances and stayed in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people. So there are a lot of Ukrainian refugees who are relying on the food bank for a multitude of reasons. But as you said earlier, there are other people, and as I alluded to, there are other people who are maybe, again, these cultural differences, this clash. They either don't understand, or they see it as something to be taken advantage of, as we've seen on the YouTube videos, you know, how to get free food in Canada. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of what causes that is what causes the rift between people who are here and people who are coming here from other places, is that we have social systems set up to help people who are struggling. And now you have this contingent of people who are here who are taking advantage of it. And like, for example, what the young lady at the food bank told me is that they have a menu, right, where you can kind of check off the things that you need. And because people have dietary restrictions, right? People have allergies and things. So that's what that menu is essentially for, is just to kind of check off the things that you need and leave the things that maybe say you have an allergy to, or, whatever, whatever, for whatever reason you can't eat. Well, what she told me was that a lot of the people from other places that are coming in are literally treating it like a menu, where like you're ordering things and then they put your basket together. But I guess the point is that what this is doing is that this is taking food out of the mouths of people who actually need it. And how do we tackle this issue? How do we have this conversation about international students and immigration without it devolving into a conversation about race?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have an answer for you. I mean, but certainly it's it does need to be talked about, and I think some of it just has to do with language barriers. I mean, one of the food banks said this was actually a former Liberal MP who was a co-executive director at a food bank, and he says he had talked to some international students from, I presume, from India, and shown them the videos on YouTube about free food, and asked them what is going on with this, and they said that they just didn't understand like how food banks worked in Canada, and they were under the impression that it was like a menu, or that you could just come and take food, but they didn't. It's not like they were being malicious or they were trying to game the system. It's just that they didn't know what a food bank was, and if they're only hearing about food banks in their native language from somebody on YouTube or on TikTok, then they're going to maybe come under that impression that it doesn't need to be treated with the same respect or not respect, but that it's of a certain. But it's different from what you'd see in India. So I think, a lot of it is just education and just telling newcomers that this is how the food bank works. And it's not for, if you're doing well, it's only for people who really need it. But it's also just a general question of affordability and, food prices going up so fast and people not being able to keep up salary wise, and the GDP per capita of Canada falling relative to the US, and all these different factors coming together and making a narrative that is certainly unpleasant.
Yeah. So with that said, I mean, let's move to the larger economic issue, because, you mentioned earlier in the discussion that people were arriving here as international students unprepared for just the insane cost of living and the inflation that we're experiencing here in Canada, and that's contributing to a lot of what we're seeing happen in terms of, abusing the food bank or other social services. So do you have any idea how this all happened? What led to where we are now? Was it just a taking off of the restraints on immigration and student visas and work visas and things, or was there another catalyst that led to this?
I'm not sure of the exact catalyst that led to it. I mean, I think, right after the pandemic, like Canada, like a lot of countries, needed labor and they needed workers, and a lot of these corporations and universities were pushing for increased immigration to get cheaper workers, to get more money for tuition, that sort of thing. And it just exploded. And we've seen that Canada technically should have been in a recession in around 2023, because we had, the official definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And we had one quarter that was negative, and we had one quarter that was like 0.1% positive growth, like just barely. And this is not just me saying it. These are like I think it was TD Bank did a report and found that the only reason that we didn't officially enter into a recession was because we had enough immigration that propped up the productivity and the consumption rate. But on a per capita basis, we've continued to decline or remain stagnant as opposed to the U.S., which has continued to get richer and richer even after the pandemic. So I don't know the exact. There's obviously a lot of different factors for why the GDP per capita has not kept up. But if you look at the trend, it started in around 2014, 2015 when it really started to decline or not keep up with the U.S. So I don't know what happened around there, but maybe maybe it was a new liberal government. Who knows? Again, a lot of different factors, but maybe one of them.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you next. Is so like we're seeing this decline begin around 2015. Of course, that's the year that Justin Trudeau is elected as prime minister. Is our economic decline directly connected to Trudeau and the liberal and his liberal government, or were there other contributing factors that kind of began the downward slide?
That's a good question. I think some factors for the Trudeau government of overregulation and sort of capping the energy sector. I know Alberta talks about that quite a bit, but that has certainly harmed some of the productivity and some of the gains that could have been seen through energy in relation to the U.S., which has had a more expansive energy policy, especially with fracking. So that's part of it. I just think in general, Canada has productivity issues when compared to the U.S. We have a lot of brain drain of people going to the U.S. to seek higher salaries, to seek better lives, and that harms things. And I think just when you live next door to the world superpower with such a large industrial capacity and so many entrepreneurs, and you have more of some would call a socialist system or a system that helps people that are a bit downtrodden in Canada, you're going to see declines in productivity, and you're not going to see as high growth. But certainly the Liberal government and some of their policies have been a factor in that.
And what's really confusing to me is that so we see this economic decline begin in 2015, and of course with the introduction of carbon taxes and emissions caps and all of the green initiatives, and then just additional arrive can things like that. Mm-hmm. these government programs where billions of dollars seem to just evaporate into nothing. It does seem to me like a lot of the people, the 4 to 5 million people who are brought into Canada are really just there to artificially inflate the economy through cheap labor. Am I accurate in my assumption there? Or I guess the question I'm asking you is, is in your view, is that a motivation for why they did this? Basically opened up the gates and let everybody in?
Yeah, I think that's a good argument. That could be part of it. I mean, certainly a lot of corporations want cheap labor. The universities especially. I mean, they like all the cuts that have had to happen to universities, getting rid of staff and coming back on programs. That is in relation to the international student pipeline being cut off a little bit and that flow being reduced. So their business models were not as sustainable without that big increase. I mean, a lot of these different countries, they increased their immigration rates at the same time. So I think there's some maybe kind of international agreements they're made. I don't have all the facts on that, right? But it seems like, Ireland, the UK, a lot of European countries, Canada, they all kind of had that big immigration push at the end of the pandemic. So I don't know what the exact agreements were, but it seemed like it was coordinated in some way. And I think one aspect that doesn't get talked about very much when people talk about immigration is just the low birth rates in a lot of Western countries. I mean, you have below replacement fertility rates in just about every developed country. Fertility policies haven't helped. It got even worse after the pandemic. And, as the former immigration minister talked about, Mark Miller, he said, even if we were to try and increase fertility rates, that's going to take decades, to get people to grow up and to be workers. And it's much easier to just bring in people that are already of working age to fill in the gap, to increase the productivity, keep the economy going, to keep the pension system running operationally. It's just a fact that we don't have the birth rates to sustain it. And it's a tough issue, and there's no easy solutions. And I haven't seen any country that's been able to turn it around. It's a natural byproduct of industrializing. In children, all of a sudden, you go from a farming society, a low like lower income, where children are an asset, suddenly they're a liability to have. They're not working for you. They're not tilling the fields and doing all these things that help out, which you'd see in poorer countries. And there's just no easy answer for that. But that's, I think, a big part of the immigration push. And until that situation gets solved in some way, or they turn it around, you're going to see a lot more of that. At least the governments are going to want to continue with the immigration push.
Yeah, and that's something that is rarely discussed, right? Is the fact that people, I mean, citizens of Western nations are having fewer children. And, and I think, of course, a big contributor to that is the cost of living, right? Like if you're barely feeding yourself, how are you supposed to feed children? I mean, I have 2 children myself, and like the bills in my house are through the roof. So it's how do you expect people in their 20s who are just starting their careers, or just finding their path, to be able to have children if they're they can barely keep the lights on? And so that seems to allude to like a bigger crisis, which is a cost of living crisis. And we're all feeling it, we're all suffering through it. And I guess of course, as we talked about earlier, the Canada's economic decline. And so, you're a guy who's on this beat quite a bit. What do we need to do to turn this around? Do you have any idea how we can fix this?
No, not really. I've talked to some experts that have given ideas, but in terms of the birth rate issue, for example, I did a longer analysis article on it, and all the people I talked to that worked at these fertility experts, they worked in agencies related to it. They said that there are some ideas, but they don't seem to work. Like there haven't been any successful ways to fix this. But I think I don't know. I mean, increase the supply of housing. Takes a long time to make housing. It's still going to be expensive. It's still going to take a while to get the permits going. If you have higher immigration rates, that's going to still bid up the price of housing, make it more unaffordable for people to get houses, to start families, to go through that process of their lives. So it's a cycle that continues repeating. So I don't know. I mean, maybe a conservative government would be better, would be different, but it's a tough situation. And there's so many different factors that all play off of each other, and it's tough.
It seems like a lot of the source of this has to do with housing costs. Like I'm from Vancouver originally. I got out of there because there's just, that place is a disaster now. But in Vancouver, the story has always been, at least for the last 30 years, or 20 years, if you want to buy a house, you got to be a millionaire. Like there's just you need a minimum of $200,000 for a down payment on a home, and so therefore, a lot of people in my generation, I'm 42, a lot of people in Vancouver at my age still don't own homes. They still don't have like stability in terms of housing. And as a parent, like that's number one, that's key. You need to have a central place that everybody in your family can call home. And if you're constantly moving, living this nomadic lifestyle, there's an inability for people to be able to plant roots anywhere and just be a part of a community or part of a neighborhood. And so, with the housing crisis in Canada, the thing that really concerns me is that all of the liberal solutions always revolve around government subsidized rental units, which, I don't know if you've ever been to subsidized housing, but it's never generally the best place for you and your children to be. And
I saw a video the other day, and it looked like not a good place to have a kid.
No. And so, in Vancouver, like the cooperative housing areas, some of them have really nice homes in them, but they're never they're not very well kept. Let's say that. And so is that the answer, to just build more government housing, more housing projects? And then in that case, I mean, if we continue bringing people into this country at the pace that we have been, how is that even going to balance, right? Because you're talking about subsidized housing units, which more than likely will be allocated to people who are new to the country before Canadian citizens. So
Yeah.
That's my main concern. My main concern is that I never hear anything from any of these politicians about wrangling in the cost of housing in Canada. It's always develop more. And if you're on the conservative side, houses for sale. If you're on the liberal side, it's houses for rent, government owns and subsidized. But there's never any discussion about how do we deflate this housing bubble that has slowly grown to consume places like Calgary and Winnipeg and places where traditionally you wouldn't see the inflated housing prices of say Vancouver and Toronto. And I guess my question to you is: have you heard anybody in government talk about how to deflate the housing bubble? And if not, why won't they touch that subject?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen anybody talk about the need to bring down the cost of people's homes. I mean, the immigration minister was asked about that shortly into his becoming that position, and he was asked about, do we need to bring down housing prices, and he said no, we don't need to do that. But that's like a lot of the people who own homes. That's a big part of their net worth, or their housing is a big asset. They don't want to see that decline. But that's just the difficulty of when you want to get into the market, but you're unable to because there's just not enough. The housing costs are too high. Like, what can you do about? You might have to have. I've talked to one economist. He talks about the need for, or I guess the incoming economic winter, where the prices of all these assets, of housing, of gold, like all these different stocks, are going to have to correct and come down and enter essentially a prolonged bear market, and that might be the only way that people can afford houses. And I've seen a lot of people my age or younger that have said they want to see like a Great Depression style collapse just so that they could get in the housing market. I mean, it's dark that you'd have to call for something like that, but without your parents helping you out or making it big in, I don't know, stocks or crypto, or just having a really good career, you're not going to be able to afford it until you're perhaps too old to start a family, or when it becomes more difficult to do so. So I haven't seen any politicians talking about the need to reduce the cost of housing. The closest would probably be Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives, saying that we need to have negative immigration for a period of a couple of years, and that reduction in the demand might, reduce housing a little bit if there's a little bit more time for more houses to get built and the supply to pick up. But that's about the closest I've seen, and he lost the election, so we'll see what Carney does.
Yeah. So, what is Mark Carney's plan for this? Has he? I mean, I've been paying attention peripherally, but it seems like the only thing that I've seen out of the Liberal Party again is more government subsidized rental units. Do they have anything? At least have they inferred that there's a plan beyond that, or is that kind of where the buck stops with them?
I got to be honest, I'm not too well versed on the exact plans that they've put forth, but I know there was similar to the Conservatives. They wanted to build, they wanted to sell off government buildings to make it affordable housing. They wanted to build homes or high density homes near rail lines, like near train stations, that sort of thing. And of course, they just want to increase the permitting process, make it easier for housing to get built. But it's, I haven't seen anything concrete that really stuck out to me as something that would really get them built quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer, like, look, coming from Vancouver myself and having grown up during Vancouver's transition from, especially where I'm from Richmond, BC, which is, the heart of China's global money laundering network. So I had a front row seat to the complete and total transition of Vancouver into this, I mean, I can't even, I don't even have the word for it. I can't explain it. It's otherworldly. It's like a different universe. Obviously, I think what I'm disappointed in is in both in our municipal, provincial, and federal governments' refusal to admit that we have a huge money laundering problem in Canada, and that we have a tremendous organized crime problem that we have to tackle, and that the organized crime problem and the money laundering is directly attached mainly to one country, China. And that this is something that we're going to have to take care of. And as we're seeing right now with the United States, if we don't take care of it, they will take care of it for us which is not going to end well for us. And I guess that's my main frustration with it all, is watching this all develop over time. Talking to Sam Cooper, I mean, he and I have recorded over 20 episodes together, and it just, the rabbit hole just gets deeper and deeper and deeper as we go. And this is all playing out directly in front of us, but yet nobody is willing to even confront it or admit that it exists, which to me, not Matthew Horwood, who is a journalist, but Jason James, who is just a dumb ass commentator on the internet. To me, just watching this all happen,
come on.
It indicates to me that there is some deeper corruption going on, that these people not only have to be aware of what's happening, but if they're reluctant or completely refusing to approach it or address it in any way, then they have to be involved to some extent or another. There's no other reason. And I think in terms of what our country has become, that is a huge part of it. We have Mexican cartels operating now in Canada in conjunction with Chinese organized crime, many of the cartels having crossed the border into Canada in 2017 after Trump was elected the first time. So we have this litany of issues, particularly related to organized crime, that none of our elected officials will even get near. They won't even talk about. And we have our federal police, our RCMP, that appear to have been politicized as well. So all of that said, what's your perspective on this? Because this is obviously this is a glaring issue. This is right in front of our faces, but yet it seems like nobody in our political establishments are willing to talk about it.
Yeah, it does seem that way. I mean, a couple of years ago, it was in the headlines when the Chinese foreign interference became newsworthy, and there was a lot of talk about, releasing more information on who the MPs were in Parliament that were, in cahoots in some standing with the Chinese government. And we never got any answers on that, and the news cycle sort of moved on. And we saw that China tried to interfere in our elections and take certain candidates that they didn't necessarily like and try to oppose them in certain ways, whether it was that NDP MP who was not invited to Chinese community events, or it was, what happened with that MP in Toronto, who they busted all these Chinese into the riding to vote. And, all these things were pretty concerning. Definitely want to see some answers on that. But I just think the news cycle moved on past that. And I also think it's such a large issue. There's so much Chinese foreign interference in a lot of Western nations that we just don't have the capacity to really get into the bottom of it and to go after it, especially when we have such integrated economic ties with China, when so many exports from that country come into us and we're so reliant on them. We want to have good relations. We're caught between wanting to deal with the issue and wanting to, get to the bottom of it. And also when the U.S. is going after China and they're putting tariffs onto them, we have to do the same thing as well. We kind of have to toe the line and go in the same direction, but we can't go too far at the same time because of our economic ties. So I don't have any answers on that. I think it's, there's deep corruption and Chinese interference in Canada, but there's no easy solutions to that. And there doesn't seem to be a political will to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I think you touched on it. I think that's what it is. It's just that we're so economically reliant on China that there's nothing that we can really do to get away from them. And because, the way I always try to explain it to people is, the way Chinese organized crime works is everything that you see as it relates to China is a direct extension of the CCP. Nothing operates without that CCP head moving the tentacles. So what you're talking about is a scenario where, imagine the Hells Angels and the Italian mafia and the Irish mob all being extensions of the American government and them all working in tandem together. And, I talked privately to a very, he got mad at me the last time I said this, so I'm trying to find a way to obscure his identity to a member of the Canadian Armed Forces who holds a significant amount of authority. I hope he's not going to be mad at me for saying that. I asked him about it, and he said that at this particular point in time, Canada really only serves as a satellite intelligence base for the CCP. That's his view. And that they are so deeply embedded in all of our inside of our political structures and our industry, that we wouldn't be able to purge them even if we tried, because it would be economically disastrous for us. And that's kind of what you've inferred in what you said previously, right? Is that we are so economically connected to China that we have to be very, very careful in the way that we approach these subjects and these matters, because, if we were to say, for example, bar Chinese investment in housing, in our housing markets, then that could damage our trade relationship, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we already had the canola tariffs that China put on us when we put tariffs on them for EVs. We followed the US's lead on that. I think it was 100% tariffs we put on Chinese EVs because they were flooding the market, and they put huge tariffs on canola exports, which harms, of course, our prairie farmers to a large extent. And they could go a lot further than that. Like, they have a lot of sway over Canada in different ways. And in the end, I mean, China has plans for global domination. They have what's called the 100-year marathon, which is by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the modern Chinese government. They want to be the number one superpower. And so I think that's also needs to be looked at in the context of that being their plan, and that they don't want the U.S. to be the world superpower and to have control over the global resources and trade and diplomacy and so forth forever. And so, if there were to be some sort of a conflict over Taiwan, if China were to move into that country, then just think of the economic pandemonium. Think of all the chips that are manufactured in Taiwan, like it's all located in that one island. All that would go up in smoke, and think of all the downstream effects of that in computers, all the phones that we use, the job losses across countries and industries that are downstream of that. I mean, it would be horrendous. And I think that's the context of that as well, is nobody wants to get into that situation. No governments want to see that happen, but it might be inevitable. I mean, we'll see what happens the next couple of years, but I've heard that China wants to take Taiwan by 2027 is the deadline that they've given, and we'll see what happens. But they've been very clear they want to go after that country, and that it's a rogue province and it's not its own nation.
Yeah, and Sam Cooper put me onto this, and it's actually quite frightening. But when anytime a bomb explodes anywhere in the world now, it's World War III, right? Like that's the automatic assumption that everybody makes on social media. Every bedroom analyst, and I guess I'm talking about myself as well, hops on X and is like, yeah, well, everybody hops on X, and all of a sudden we're in World War III. But there really are three moving pieces to this puzzle, right? There's Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Israel, and China and Taiwan. And China and Taiwan is the one that has really kind of moved under the radar. And I can't help but think that that's intentional, because that's the one that actually really does threaten a potential third world war scenario, because they are going to invade Taiwan. They are going to attempt to reclaim it at some point in time. And the moment they do that is the moment the world goes to war, because it's the United States and NATO will get involved immediately. And we've already seen Chinese aggression toward the Philippines and other islands in the South China Sea. So when that happens, that is really what's going to kick off a large scale war, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so,
unless Trump, go on. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Matthew. Go.
Yeah, just unless Trump decides that he doesn't want to, because the U.S. has strategic ambiguity about whether they would support Taiwan in an event of a war. I mean, Trump could decide just to hold off on that, but it was revealed recently that Trump told China and Russia during his first term that if they went after Ukraine or Taiwan, then he would bomb Russia and China, which is probably posturing, likely, but it goes to show, I think, that would be a red line under even an isolationist, so to speak, like Trump. But yeah, I mean, the Taiwan situation has been under the radar. A lot of the focus has been on the situation with Iran and Israel, and we do have a peace that was secured. Trump wants to call it something like the 14-day war, but Iran is saying that they will continue with their nuclear weapons program. I saw today it was an Iranian official saying they don't really trust the peace that they have with Israel, that they're kind of preparing for the next volley, so to speak. And if the U.S. has all their assets diverted from the Pacific, where they want to have about 60% of their total naval assets, if they divert that to the Middle East to support Israel, then that becomes a good opening for China to go after Taiwan. But the question is if Taiwan would, or if China would go for that, because China is not self-sufficient in terms of energy, in terms of food. It's reliant on shipping lanes that the U.S. controls, so to speak. So they would incur heavy losses, and that would be disastrous for them. But I mean, China is also building landing crafts specifically for landing on Taiwanese beaches so that they can get tanks and other ground assets onto the beaches. They built, it was basically a reconstruction of the Taiwanese parliament in the middle of like the desert, and they were presumably practicing special operations to take out the Chinese leadership in an operation like a special forces operation. So they clearly have plans to do so. It's just a question of whether they are able to find their opening and whether they're willing to incur the costs.
Yeah, and that would be economically devastating for them if they're cut off from those shipping lanes, correct?
Yep.
So now I guess the next question is I mean, obviously that's why China has tried to maintain, some form of neutrality, at least publicly and to visually in front of the eyes of, Western observers. But what we do know is that, beneath the veneer of goodwill or at least trying to portray themselves as being a decent trade partner, they've been running a hybrid war strategies against Western nations for at least 20 years. And, there's a lot of evidence that suggests the fentanyl epidemic in North America is a direct attack by China on our soil. Do you have any insight on that? Do you have any thoughts? And do you see it that way? Like that this is kind of an attack on the West, or on North America, I should say.
Yeah, I could see it as purposeful. I mean, if you look at Chinese history, they had a century of virtual humiliation where they were, the victim of the Opium Wars. They fought and lost 2 wars against the UK to try and stop opium from coming into the country and devastating their own citizens. They were, invaded by multiple Western powers in the Boxer Rebellion. They were invaded by China and went through horrific genocides, and well, not genocides, but like millions of people died after that invasion. And then they were also fighting a civil war amongst themselves. So they had a rough time of that. And you could almost see it as maybe, in their view, karmic justice to be flooding the West with fentanyl and attacking them in response to the Opium Wars. But China's been in a situation where they went through a lot. They were once the Middle Kingdom. They were once a vast power, and they went through a period where they were just getting kicked around by everybody. So the government clearly doesn't want to be in that situation, and they want to get back on top. They want to be in control. And I think if they're not going to do too much to try and stop the fentanyl from coming into North America. Not to say that they're expressly overseeing that process and controlling it, but when Trump says he wants China to take action and stop the fentanyl from coming over, I don't think that they're going to be overly concerned with that. Or they might say, "Oh yeah, we're going to take some measures to do that. We're going to be on top of it." But it's all talk in the end.
And what about the liberal messaging around this? Because that's the other one that's made me quite. I mean, it's disturbing to hear Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney stand in front of television cameras and blatantly lie about the amount of fentanyl, both in our country and entering the United States from our country. But it's even more confusing because you would think that this, again, would be something that they would want to tackle head on and get taken care of, because it is such a corrosive force in our country. And, of course, Kash Patel with the FBI and Donald Trump have all pointed to Canada as being a main source for fentanyl, but yet it seems like we're digging in our heels and just saying no, just in this this cycle of denial, rather than making any attempt to really investigate further or figure out what's going on and how the fentanyl is not just entering our country, but entering the United States through our country. What do you have any idea why the Liberal government are so reluctant to at least admit that we have a problem?
That's a good question. I don't have any analysis or ideas about why they won't admit to it. I mean, it's certainly the liberals always try to compare it to Mexico, which has a much larger drug problem and more drug smuggling going into the states, and they try and say, well, yes, it is an issue in Canada, but look at Mexico. That's a much larger problem, and that should be put in context. But I think the measures that they've put in place, the 1.4 billion for border security, the 24/7 border surveillance, the fentanyl SAR, I get the guy in the position to try and take care of the issue. It is maybe token measures. It's not going to certainly solve the issue, and the U.S. might see it as not going far enough. But I think it's just such, like with the Chinese foreign interference, it's such a large, vast issue that we don't have a handle on, and we don't have the resources to really get to the bottom of it. And maybe we don't have the political will or capital, or the voters don't care enough about going after that issue, as opposed to some other things to do with affordability and tariffs and the cost of living and housing and all these sorts of things. It kind of falls to the back burner. And especially when Indian foreign interference sort of became the narrative over the last year or so, that was more of the focus of the killing of that gentleman who was associated with the Sikh nationalist movement. That was more of the narrative, and that was, I guess, playing better. Canada doesn't have nearly as much trade with India. We're able to, I guess, flex our muscles at them a little bit easier compared to China, who could devastate us a lot more economically.
And that's what I guess I keep saying I'm confused, and I am. That's the point of this podcast, is me just trying to figure out the fuck is happening in this world. But like the thing is it just seems like we have a litany of problems. We have all these problems, and look, I don't think they're unique to Canada, because a lot of what we're dealing with, the United States is also dealing with, Britain, Ireland, Sweden, right? Like, you go around the world to all Western nations, and we all seem to be dealing with a mixed bag of problems at the same time, many of which are very similar to each other, or if not exactly the same mirror images, right? And like, the thing with the foreign interference that drives me nuts is we've now held 2 commissions on it, right? We've now held these big, long, drawn out, and public inquiries into foreign interference, and both times our commissioners come back, saying there's nothing going on, and those people having clearly been politicized, right? And so, like, now we're like at this point where it's like, look, no matter how you feel about it or what side of the political aisle you are on, we obviously have a problem. So it doesn't help us to just to waste all this time and tax dollars on these public inquiries just for these puppets for whatever party is in power at the time to come back and say, we've concluded that there is no problem. It's like, well, then what the fuck are we doing? Then why are we doing all this? Maybe we should are we just going to continue to ignore it until it flares up and turns into a wildfire that's out of our control?
Yeah. Well, like the Foreign Interference Commission, I reported on the final report, and they did say that there was foreign interference. They talked about, in China especially is the greatest threat in terms of that. They said, surprisingly, Russia wasn't doing a whole lot. There wasn't a main concern, but like they did say that it was threatening to Canada's democracy, and that was sort of the main picture of what could go wrong, is if we lost trust in the democratic institutions, if we kind of moved towards a more authoritarian direction compared to China. And like they had a litany of recommendations. There were over 100. I can't remember all of them. I'm not a supercomputer with all that information in my head, but it did seem like it was pretty thorough. But the question is if it's enough. And I think that, what we've seen over the last decade indicates that it's just not enough, because the problem has gotten continually worse, and any sort of attention that's been paid to the issue by our politicians, by people at large, the Canadians who cared about it, has sort of gone away and got swept under the rug. And we didn't get any sort of main solution to the issue of Chinese foreign interference. And as long as China wants to become the number one superpower, and as long as they're going to continue to go after that goal, then no amount of commissions is going to solve the issue. It's just one of the many incalculable issues that Canada faces right now. And as you said, many other nations face at this point.
And see, my real concern underlying all this is, you and I just spent 53 minutes kind of summarizing a few of the many problems that our country faces right now. And these are very real problems. These are things that are affecting people, I mean, to a degree where a lot of working people can barely afford to survive in this country. And what we have are the conditions that generally lead to a revolution if they're not rectified in some way, shape, or form. And in closing, for our final subject, I do want to talk to you about the Freedom Convoy, because what I've said for a long time is that the convoy was not the end, or not the crescendo of a general sentiment that was shared amongst thousands of Canadians. It was a symptom of something bigger coming. And what I'm really scared about is we are heading toward something. We are heading toward a wall. And when we hit that wall, how are people going to react? And we had hit that first wall during COVID, and that's what led to the Freedom Convoy and trucks and thousands, tens of thousands of people descending on Ottawa for 3 weeks and basically taking that city, holding that city hostage. Now, not in those words exactly, because I myself was a Freedom Convoy supporter. I donated three times what I could afford.
Oh, nice.
So I want to ask you, like, now in the aftermath of the Freedom Convoy, Tamara Lich, Chris Barber are still going through Canada's court system. Where are we at with that? Where are we at with their trial? What are they currently being accused of? And when will they see some sort of resolution to their situation?
So the trial, it's lasted for about a year and a half. It was only supposed to last about 14 days, but we're finally getting to the end of it. Chris Barber and Tamara Lich were charged with mischief, and Barber was charged with counseling others to disobey a court order for a TikTok video he posted after an injunction against honking was brought in. He told the supporters to honk if they saw police officers coming, but they weren't charged with counseling others to commit mischief. That charge was stayed by the Crown, and intimidation, obstructing police, they weren't charged with that either. We're at a point where his lawyers are trying to argue for a stay of proceedings for a officially induced error of law, because Barber was given erroneous legal advice by his lawyers, by the police, by the judge in this when the injunction was being brought in. From my own analysis, it's looking like that's not going to fly based on what I've seen the Crown and the judge say about this. It's looking like the trial is going to go on, but if that were to happen, then the charges would essentially be all thrown out. And at this point, they're going to be getting sentencing over the next 2 weeks. In the next 2 weeks, the Crown is asking for 2 years of jail time for the two of them. They also want Chris Barber's truck, Big Red, to be sold off, to be auctioned off. For context, Pat King, another one of the organizers, he was charged with mischief, counseling others to commit mischief, counseling others to obstruct the police, disobeying a court order, all sorts of things. But he only got 3 months house arrest, 100 hours of community service, and 1 year probation after that. So it's not looking like Tamara Lich and Chris Barber are going to get a hefty sentencing. The judge has been pretty fair thus far in the trial. She's been hasn't shown maybe a partisan slant that I've seen. So it's looking like maybe they'll get off pretty easy, but it remains to be seen. Within the next 2 weeks, we'll know.
And this was supposed to just be a mischief trial, right? Which in itself was stupid, and obviously very politically motivated. I think that they were reaching for something that they could get them on, because now let me ask you this, because the convoy basically took over Ottawa and shut everything down for 3 weeks, and now obviously a lot of what went on there fell under right to protest laws, right? Like, you know, whatever thin free speech laws we have here in Canada. And
Mhm.
so there, through all of that mayhem and chaos that went on there, which to me was beautiful. It was, I think it was, we were in a time where most people felt hopeless, and I feel like the Freedom Convoy brought hope to a lot of people. It did for me. That's
Mhm.
why I donated to it and was a huge supporter of it, because I felt at that time it was a perfect representation of the way Canadian people felt. I was living in Vancouver at the time, which is like Canada's California. It's as far left as you can get, and even there, you could just feel that people felt lighter. That finally we were having our say. We were letting the government know, our federal government know how we felt about vaccine mandates and lockdowns and all of this restrictions and just, you know, insane shit that we had to deal with for in the years leading up to that moment.
Yeah.
And so, but if you're looking at this from the government's perspective, they want to nail Chris Barber and Tamara Lich if they can. And so
Mhm.
why did they go to mischief? Was there nothing else there that they could in what happened that they could use as a criminal charge against them?
Well, I think that's why they went for mischief, intimidation, counseling others to disobey the police, like all these different charges, because they thought they had a case and that it was going to stick based on the evidence. But clearly, based on what the judge ruled, there wasn't like she said, intimidation is very distinct from the charge of mischief. And the way the Crown tried to argue for it and provide evidence for it, it was almost like they were the same thing. And in terms of counseling others to disobey the police, like there's lots of video footage during the convoy. The entire thing was live streamed. To Chris Barber and Tamara Lich were uploading videos on social media, and they were saying to the protesters, "Follow what the police are saying. Don't disobey the law. Do anything you can to, make yourself work together with the police." So they were not, counseling others to disobey the police at all. And the judge even said, the fact that you guys worked together with the police, you tried to work together with the the city, you move the trucks out of the downtown core when you were requested to do so. That's going to be an alleviating factor in the sentencing. Like that's going to play into not having such severe of a sentencing, which is again why I say that they're probably not going to get the 2 years jail time. And in terms of trying to auction off the truck, I don't see any reason why they would go for that as opposed to trying to get rid of or to destroy the symbol of the Freedom Convoy. I mean, Big Red is synonymous with that protest. It was the lead truck that traveled all the way from Saskatchewan to Ottawa to set this protest off. But I can't see that happening in the end. But I do think, yeah, the government wanted to get them for that. They couldn't have this protest, this uprising against the government go without any sort of consequences, which is why they're pushing for so many different charges and such severe jail time for the two of them, because they need to make an example out of them.
How does the legal system go about confiscating a privately held asset?
I am not a lawyer, so I do not know the details of that. I just know that that's
Yeah.
what the court is going for. They do perhaps have the legal grounds to argue for that. I haven't seen the exact legal arguments yet about why they should take away the truck. That will be coming in the next couple of weeks, and I'll have a better idea about how they can do that. But I just know that that's what they're pushing for, and it's not looking likely. I wouldn't imagine they'd go for that. It seems a bit silly, right?
It does. And,
He
you know,
also
it
used it for work.
seems,
Like he's still using this truck for his trucking business. His son, I believe, is part of the business as well. So it wouldn't make sense. Like he's not like he's using it to go to more protests and do more of these like rallies and take over more cities. Like it's his work property. It's part of the company.
yeah. And it just seems, I mean, obviously it seems like they want to destroy both Leach and Barber, and they're going after them in the only ways that they can within the bounds of the law. But it just seems to me, I mean, the whole thing, look, realistically speaking, just from a realistic perspective, there was no way that the Freedom Convoy was the size of that protest. I mean, it was, I want to say, it was easily the biggest civil rights movement in Canadian history, but it was one that influenced massive protests in other countries around the world. You could draw a parallel between, or a connection between, the Freedom Convoy in Canada and then the farmers' protests in Europe, because those sparked shortly after the trucker convoy arrived in Ottawa, right? And
Yeah.
you saw another similar protest, another convoy in the United States. It seemed like it inspired people around the world to kind of do the same thing. So considering the weight of that and the influence that Tamara Lich and Chris Barber had around the world, at that point, if I were them, I wouldn't assume that we are going to walk away from this easy peasy once this is over, right? But in typical Canadian fashion,
Yeah.
it seems like our government and our legal system is jumping through hoops to try to make something happen that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so with Tamara Lich, is she facing the same identical charges as Chris Barber, or is she charged with lesser crimes?
She's charged with lesser crimes because she didn't go on TikTok and encourage people to honk after the court injunction came in. So she only has one charge. Chris Barber has two, and she's already spent time in jail. Like keep in mind, she directly after the convoy, she was arrested. She spent time in jail, and then she allegedly violated her bail conditions when she met with another protest leader at an event, and she was taken from out west back to Ottawa and spent even more time in jail. So there's, the time that she has served is going to also be an alleviating factor in the sentencing as well. And I don't believe that she's ever been charged with anything before. She's like a 5'2" grandmother, like very sweet woman. So probably not going to bring down the hammer on her. The justice, again, like I think Heather Perkins McVeigh, she has been very fair. As much as people don't like her and want to demonize her for the sentencing, having sat through virtually the entire trial and seen the arguments that she's made and the way she's pushed back against the Crown when the Crown has tried to kind of go overboard with their arguments, I think she's very down the middle. She's very smart. She's very unbiased, as much as the judge can be in this regard. So I can't see her bringing down the hammer on the two of them, just based off of what I've seen and the reading I've done about her with previous trials.
And what has been the prosecution's argument against them?
Just that they occupied the downtown core and that it wasn't that their beliefs were overboard and that the beliefs made them criminals, but the way they went about the protests of bringing the trucks downtown, the constant honking, the diesel fumes and the smoke and the honking that kept people up at night, the intimidation that some people faced living downtown, being around people with those sorts of political ideals, that made them criminals and that made them liable to be persecuted, or not persecuted, but to be charged with these crimes. Prosecuted. Yeah, you got it.
Well, I would actually think persecuted is a more proper word here.
You could look at it that way too. Official term, prosecuted.
Yeah, it's just it's amazing that this thing continues and that this still goes on in the aftermath of it, and that mischief, and what was the other one that Chris Barber is charged with?
Counseling others to disobey police instruction.
It just seems so petty and stupid, and like going after his truck, private property, which I don't think they're going to end up being able to get their hands on his truck. I think that's just another way to harass him and bully him. And, look, no matter what you think about Chris Barber and Tamara Lich, I think they did their country. I think that, honestly, look, if I'm being completely honest, I think they're heroes. I think they did something for Canadians and the people of this country and people around the world, that they did something that most people will never accomplish. They instilled hope. Those two singular individuals created something that reinvigorated most of us at a time where we felt defeated and like there was no way out. Right. And that's why people, myself, but I mean, even people around me, everybody I knew emphatically supported the Freedom Convoy, because we needed to have a voice. We needed to be able to fight back. We had endured years of nonsensical restrictions, things that were not based in science in any way, shape, or form. And we finally had our say. We finally had a voice. And not did we just have a voice, but we roared.
Mm-hmm.
And, look, realistically speaking, of course, they're not just going to walk away from it. You knew that there was going to be some level of harassment. It's just crazy to me that we're still here, 2 years later? And now they're trying to, Tamara Lich, who has already been in prison for this, they are attempting to put her in prison again for another 2 years, which, as you mentioned, more than likely won't happen. But who knows, right? Like, look where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy to see. I mean, if you look at the support for the Freedom Convoy, there were polls that came out, I remember during that time, and the talking heads in the media, the mainstream media, pointed out that only about 35% of Canadians supported the Freedom Convoy. The rest were either opposed or they didn't have any opinion on it. Well, if you looked at the results of the 2021 election, there was a larger percentage of people who supported the Freedom Convoy than voted for the Liberals. And I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the narrative around the pandemic and the need for lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all these sorts of things, even despite all that, despite the messaging for 2 years, the fact that 35% of Canadians supported the Freedom Convoy was, I think, indicative of a huge amount of popularity, a huge reckoning that the government had with ordinary Canadians that were just fed up with the 2 years of pandemic restrictions. And I think if they were to do polling these days, and especially if with all the reporting on, let's say, vaccine harms and some of the downsides of lockdowns and mandatory masking and all these sorts of things, the support levels would probably be higher, especially if the CBC and the mainstream media went with a different narrative that was a little bit more down the middle, a little bit less biased these days. So yeah, certainly the support they had at the time was incredible. And I think as history goes on, they will be vindicated. And, depending on, they say history is written by the victor, depending on how they do with the sentencing and depending on if there's any more of a reckoning in terms of, things that come out about the Freedom Convoy or about the pandemic or about vaccine harms or about the Emergencies Act, if that supports the narrative that we agreed with, that people who supported the Freedom Convoy were agreed with, then, that Tamara Lich and Chris Barber's popularity will be much greater in the future, and they will be hailed as victors in history.
Final question: were the Canadian people the victors, or I mean, even global citizens the victors as a result of the outcome of the Freedom Convoy?
It's a good question. Depends how you look at it. I mean, I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that they were instrumental in getting the vaccine passports taken down. The government would never admit to that, and they point out that this only happened, like, they made the decision on their own weeks after the Freedom Convoy ended. But I think you can argue that that was instrumental in getting them at least taken down quicker. And for that, I think, yeah, it was a victory. I mean, it didn't end the way that people wanted it to, but in the end, I think it ended relatively peacefully. I mean, I know there was the footage of people getting trampled by horses and hit with batons and all these arrests, but in terms of how the protests could have gone, it was relatively peaceful. There were no losses of life. There were not that many injuries. At least, when I was there, I didn't see protesters directly fighting with the police. And I, in fact, saw a lot of protesters trying to get people to stop other protesters who were trying to, even throw snowballs or throw punches at police. They were told to get out of here because we didn't want the protest to end in that sort of a way. That was the narrative. And in terms of it also ending relatively peacefully, I think that was a victory for what the message was of peace, of unity, of trying to come together, in terms of how it potentially could have ended if the sort of thing that happened in Coutts had been the defining message, if that had happened in Ottawa, so to speak. So I think in a lot of different ways you can look at it as a victory, but there were some losses, and there's a lot as well to be upset about and to be sort of wishing things could have gone better in terms of the whole protest.
I agree. I hold the same view. I actually think we were the victors in ways that we don't even understand yet, that we won't understand for years to come, because this isn't the last time something like this is going to happen. And I mean, governments attempting to vastly expand their power. And, like what we saw during COVID, again, no matter which side of the argument you're on, it was a massive expansion of power and massive overreach. And I think the Freedom Convoy will resonate and sit in the back of the minds of the people who would attempt to take our rights and our freedom from us in the future. That this is always a possibility, that this could happen. And I think in that way we won, because it will make the bad guys have second thoughts in the future. So
yeah,
Matthew
definitely.
Horwood,
I'm with you on that.
my brother, dude, thank you so much for talking to me today, man. It was awesome. Like, really,
Yeah,
dude.
thank you.
I love your reporting. I swing through Epoch Times every now and then. That's why when you reached out to me, right away I was like, dude, you want to be on my podcast? But before we get out of here, man, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find me, as you said, Epoch Times. I write a couple stories per day, a larger story once a week that goes in our newspaper edition, and I'm on Twitter at Matthew H_ET. Just search my name up, Matthew Horwood, and you'll find me on Twitter, and you can give me a follow there.
Yeah, everybody follow this guy. You are one of the few actual real journalists still at work today, man. It's very rare. I said to you privately before we started, maybe I actually said it while we were recording, but you know, everything has been editorialized, and that's kind of what I'm struggling with lately, and why I'm skewing back on some of the guests that I have on the podcast and talking to real journalists, because I feel like you guys don't get enough attention or appreciation for what you do. It is very difficult to cover anything without injecting your own opinion or bias, right? And for listeners out there, before we even started, Matthew told me, hey man, I'm not going to be able to give you like the big 1-2 punch combinations, because I have to stay objective. And that's what a real journalist is. They are objective, and they refrain from sharing their own viewpoints and opinions for the sake of accuracy and just telling the truth. And my brother, I admire you for what you do. You are a way better man than I. I am an editorial writer till I die, because I do not have the ability or the patience to suppress my emotions and not speak my mind at times where I really feel a burning sensation inside and like I want to scream. So
so that's fair enough. Sometimes you have to have editorials, and you have to have people to cut through the facts and get to the crux of the matter. And I think that's as good as it is to have reporting that's non-biased. Sometimes it can leave out just how insane a policy is, or just how many different ways it's a screw up, or that, you know. So that's why it's good to have people like you who do, you know, your writing is it's good editorials. You make really solid points, and you're not only on the right side of the spectrum. I see sometimes you're a little bit in the middle. You're seeing the other side, or you're playing the devil's advocate, which is also good to have, and it lends more credibility to people who write their own opinions and write editorials in the manner that you know, we have on our website. So that's also needed, and it's also much appreciated.
Well, you know, it's I started on the left. I'm a liberal at heart forever, not a capital L Canadian liberal. I mean, liberal.
No, I was liberal too. Exactly. Years ago, I was more leftist. So
yeah, me too. I mean, I was like deep in the left, man. I like, you know, you could have maybe spotted me wearing a che Guevara shirt in my early 20s, you know, and I actually knew who he was and what he represented. But you know, I mean, naturally, as time went on and as things as history took the course that it took, I found myself in the middle. And, you know, whenever I write something, I always know which side I landed on, because I either get 100 emails saying I'm a communist or 100 emails saying I'm a fascist. So that's how I know where I was on certain issues. But I try to be right down the middle, man. I know a lot of people view me as being conservative or as being right wing, but I'm not. I'm a liberal. I'll always be a liberal. I just refuse to like ignore corruption and injustice and, you know, cult behavior when it's on my side. And that's what brought me to the middle. That's it, man.
Yeah. Well, what it means to be a liberal has also shifted in the last couple of years as well. I mean, a lot of people are wondering, you know, they'll say online, I haven't changed my political opinion, so how did I end up getting called a Nazi or called like far right, when I'm just, you know, it's like, where did you guys go? Why did the left leave me? So that's also an aspect that happens. But as you get older, I think you naturally become a bit more conservative. I mean, when I was in university, everybody around me was leftist. All my professors were leftist. So that it also is something that happens to people.
I think it's just, you just come in contact with the real world. You know, you look at your pay stub and you're like, what the fuck, you know, and like, you know, it has a real effect on you. And like, for me, it was, Barack Obama that pushed me to the middle, because I felt like I had been hoodwinked.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it was clear that the Democrats were no better than the Republicans, and that the neoconservative skeleton that runs the machine was running the Obama administration as well. And
Yeah.
so for me, I just had to be realistic with myself and say, like, look, if I'm going to, I spent, you know, what, 8 years writing, you know, I mean, I'm in my 20s, right? So there is no restraint whatsoever. You know, basically writing death threats to the Bush Cheney administration over the war in Iraq. So it would be hypocritical and disingenuous of me to see Barack Obama behave as a continuation of that without calling it out. And that's what pushed me to the middle. Literally, it was Barack Obama. And I was one of those guys who went out and celebrated the night he was elected because I thought a black president was going to change the world. I was that fucking dumb. Right. And
Yeah.
so,
That happens.
you know, it does. Right. And look, nothing to do with his skin color at all. He just was a terrible president. And, you know, at least in my view. And so, yeah, man, it's here you and I are in the middle. And Matthew Horwood, I'm so fucking grateful for you, dude. I'm so grateful
you, man.
for voices like yours, and I really hope that more people follow your lead and you know, restrain themselves from being the objective or the subjective idiots like me, and being more of an objective observer and journalist like you. So, yeah, man, thanks.
No, I wouldn't go that far to be subjective. Say you're subjective, but I do appreciate it, and it was a great conversation.
Yeah, likewise, man. Dude, I really enjoyed it, man. And I appreciate you, dude. I appreciate you giving me your time, and thanks again, man.
Yeah, thank you.